Welcome to the Ortho Joe Show, a joint production of the Journal of Bone and Joint Surgery and OrthoEvidence. In our world, orthopedic research is king, and current topics from our respective publications are analyzed weekly. Here is Mohit Bhandari from OrthoEvidence and Marc Swinkowski from the Journal of Bone and Joint Surgery.
Well, good morning, or actually good afternoon, Mo. And it's been a while since we've had an Ortho Joe recording, and it's the afternoon here, so I don't need my coffee. But and I think you've been traveling, so unless you brought your cup.
No, but I've got some. I'm going to get some brewing very shortly. I'm going to take the whole thing, just the whole thing. Yeah, that's when you get these 5 a.m. morning flights, or you got to get up early, and you know how it is. Yeah, you've traveled a lot. You know the story.
Yeah, well, I also know that you've been traveling around the world lately, and
battery's near empty. I just trying to refill it up a bit. That's all.
Yeah, climbing mountains in Borneo and some such things like that, and
being dragged up mountains in Borneo. I should say climbing is the opposite. Yes, but anyway, there's no chairlifts up to 4,000 meters. I wish there were.
Unbelievable. You'd think there'd at least be a tow lift or something, but
I know.
Anyway,
I know.
So it's time for us to dig back into our respective publications and just talk about what's new and fresh. So I'm actually going to defer to you and let you go first. I think you've got a couple slides to show, and
I do.
It relates to the OTA meeting that we
just... Right. So for those who didn't get the opportunity to attend a very large meeting, the Orthopaedic Trauma Association this year, it was in Florida, and there were some pretty important papers, trials that came out, and I'm going to focus on a couple. There's lots that we could talk about, but there's a couple of issues that I thought were really relevant to the practice of trauma and OrthoEvidence. If I can just do a quick slide share, put together what we call the highlights of this particular meeting, talking about particularly some of the randomized trials. Now, I'm not going to only show you randomized trials, Marc, but I do want to get some of your thoughts on this. And, I suspect some of our listeners will also have some interest in the topic area. So this is an insight that's come out. We have a part 2 coming out this Saturday as well. But let's take a look, if we could, just going to the first slide. There was a couple of real interesting papers on trauma anti-sepsis, and so much around, and I think you could generalize it to anti-sepsis in general. But one big issue has been lots and lots of fundamental studies in the past have often used, various different agents, antiseptic agents, and trying to figure out, well, which ones do we use? We have open fractures, we have contaminated bone. What do we do? And there's been, povidone based stuff. There's chlorhexidine. There's been, alcohol, non-alcohol based, all sorts of approaches. And for the most part, there has been a general sense that in open fractures, you want to avoid alcohol. You want to keep it out of the wound, and therefore the aqueous-based chlorhexidine irrigation systems typically work the best. And so, when they put in this particular study, it was a basic science study, chlorhexidine treatment achieved complete disinfection of a grossly contaminated cortical segment without affecting its mechanical properties. That paper was interesting to me. But as you and I both know, there's been a lot of stories around fundamental science stuff not always working out when you actually, do the trials in patients. So interesting trial comes out. This was a group that was also published, and there's an ACE report associated with this in OrthoEvidence, published simultaneously in the Lancet, a randomized trial of 1,640 patients. And this was run by a number of investigators. The presenter of this one was Gerard Slobodin of Baltimore Shock Trauma specifically, but the University of Maryland. And they asked a simple question, there's lots of evidence in the surgical literature to suggest chlorhexidine should be our treatment.
Abdominal surgery primarily.
Correct. But what about aqueous now, not alcohol-based povidone or povidone-iodine? What is the potential benefit of this, and is there any value to even considering it? So that was their hypothesis around, well, what is going to be the answer? Well, as you can imagine, as a lot of large trials do, it suggested they both work equally well. One can argue, well, there was no difference between the two, but functionally the point here is you can use either. And the statement here is very interesting to me, because when you get rid of the alcohol, because a lot of the iodine-based products are alcohol-based, and you almost wonder if the active engaging ingredient that's doing a lot of the good in other areas is the alcohol-based, products. Because when you take away the alcohol, they both perform pretty well. So there's that point. Now, one thing you will remember is many years prior, we had had the same situation around irrigating wounds, and we found that actually saline works better than soap, but we didn't test iodine and we didn't test chlorhexidine, for example. So I guess my broader question, to pause here for a moment, is does all this make sense to you at this point? I mean, should we basically at this point consider this topic done? Or are there other areas of nuance that we should be considering when looking at this data and applying it to our patients?
Yeah, I guess my impression, based on my knowledge of this series of trials, is that yes, I think we're done. I would say with a high degree of confidence that the flow trial definitely answered the questions of low pressure versus high pressure, and answered the question of soap versus saline. And in the Lancet trial just published, I think the answer is clear that either of these prep solutions are adequate and equally efficacious. But the real issue is that I think all of these centers involved in these trials are highly experienced trauma centers with highly experienced surgeons. And as you and I have been teaching for decades, what really matters in open fracture management is the quality of the debridement. So I suppose you could propose a trial where the debridements weren't top notch and see if these two preps made a difference. But I think that would really be an ethical issue that would be, it would be hard to get by an IRB, and probably many would not agree to participate, patients and surgeons. So I would say I think the answers are in for these two particular questions.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the one thing I will say is that at the meeting, this investigator group, the PrepIt investigator, which is a large group of investigators through multiple institutions and multiple, as you said, institutions with quite a bit of experience, said that they have one more data set that is closing out, which is the alcohol-based use of chlorhexidine and povidone-iodine. So that's the only thing that's the unknown, but that's enclosed in open fractures, because in open fractures, again, the issue of alcohol in a wound is particularly, it's the one area that no one has really ventured to even test because of black box warnings around alcohol in open wounds.
Cytotoxic, desiccating, all those problems. Yeah.
That's correct. So I think that's but the only thing that I've heard them say is left to discuss. But you're right. I think your point's taken. These trials will hopefully conclude this debate and allow us to spend resources in other areas that require that energy and time. I will, if I could also, sorry, I didn't want to cut you off. You're going to say something.
No, go ahead.
Okay. I was going to get one other quick one in because I think it's an important one that is near and dear to your heart.
Yeah, absolutely.
Trauma hip. So how many times, and this is a case series, and we've talked lots about the value of case series. This is one where I thought it was a particularly valuable in that what this did, and it fundamentally, and I've looked just at the percentage of major complication is really what the point here is to be saying, is that major complications after non-displaced femoral neck fractures, in this case valgus impacted, a study of 207 patients that was a group that was out of South Carolina, basically presenting this work, talks about the value of a case series, Marc, in that you can identify real problems, and these problems can then come up with, well, what would be the potential solutions? But if you look at major complications, they're anywhere from 15 to 20% following what we would consider standard of care being internal fixation. And it didn't appear that there was any one protective approach to this. The thing I would also say to you is that they make a point at the end of saying, well, maybe we should be thinking of primary arthroplasty in a select patients in this group to reduce the risk of reoperation. So they're saying, 1 in 5 patients, maybe there is another reason to do something. And if you recall, our own work from the face suggested that, listen, femoral neck shortening is not benign, and that even the operatively treated fractures that are the undisplaced, we see a third of them go on to shortening, and that shortening can lead to, decreased gait velocity, impaired gait symmetry, and ultimately that median shortening can be up to 10 millimeters. So I wanted to get your take, if I could, on, are we heading in the right direction? And, with Faith, we did talk a lot about internal fixation options, but what about for the undisplaced fractures, arthroplasty options?
Yeah, that seems, at first glance, that seems to be an outrageous suggestion. And your original question is, what's the value of cohort studies? And Cohort studies, I think, are really good for framing a question, but they really have to be ideally prospective, and the adjudication of the complications really should be done in a blinded manner in order to make sure we're not just
Yeah,
receiving a group of investigators bias on a topic.
absolutely.
And I honestly don't know this particular cohort study well enough to know whether it
Yeah,
was done with blinded evaluation of outcomes and all the
yeah,
things that we know are
yeah.
important for a well done prospective cohort study.
Right.
So boy, I could be convinced, if it was really, really well done, that there might be a question there, but it just, at face value, a non-displaced fracture, or certainly an impacted fracture without any significant angulation, less than 10 degrees, that seems aggressive
Oh no,
at
and
first
that
blush.
right, and I think that's the point, right? Is that
Mm.
we're starting to see this data come out, and you're right. I fully agree with you that one case series doesn't make a whole program of research, but at least it starts getting us thinking about, well, maybe this debate should be had. And when you talk about major complications, we're talking, at least the way they described it, as complications just as secondary procedures. Now, who knows why they went on secondary procedures? There's a
Right.
whole bunch of bias associated with why someone gets onto it, depending on
Yeah.
who the individuals are. But my perception here is that as this discussion starts being had, we're going to start seeing more and more insights. And maybe you're right. Maybe there will be some early pilot work coming out from investigators that might even consider randomizing, and then we'll see what comes of this. The truth of the matter is that this debate is far from over, and if anything, it looks like it's just getting started.
Yeah. Well, it's been going on since 1922, when I think it was Kellogg Speed said, we enter the world under the brim of the pelvis and we exit through the neck of the femur."
Oh,
There's much more to be done, even though I have spent 35, 40 years looking at it, and you 25, 30 years looking at it, and still more work to do. We
yeah,
won't be unemployed over
no,
this question.
it is still an unsolved fracture after all these years, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, from the journal side, I'm very pleased to have received my print copy of the symposium that we did a year ago on the use of administrative data sets and registries in orthopedics. And it's free online to anybody. It's available. And it's a series of 10 publications that came out of this meeting, which was held in Chicago. And it was supported by Dan Barry and Dave Llewellyn, who have a P32 grant with the NIH on optimum studies in arthroplasty, as well as the journal, as well as Orthopedic Research and Education Foundation. And it brought together about 40 experts on this topic. And there's an editorial which we did. John Callahan, the editor emeritus from Journal of Arthroplasty, also participated in the organization, and it was really, really very worthwhile. And we at the journal receive a lot of submissions from these administrative databases as well as the joint registries. And I would urge anybody who's considering doing this kind of work to use this tool to understand what the limitations of the various databases are out there. And it covers, the national CMS databases to the proprietary insurance company databases like Pearl Diver, et cetera. What are the limitations? Pointing out such important things that CPT codes, which are used for analysis, are not really specific for something as simple as a primary total knee arthroplasty, that there are other diagnoses that can lead to different types of outcomes that are mixed into that same CPT code. And I'm hopeful that this will be used by researchers who are considering using these administrative data sets so that they don't waste a lot of time and that they focus their questions within the constraints of the database. There's also a couple of manuscripts on the international joint registries, what's contained in the various registries in the Nordic registries in Australia, and how they can be optimized. And there's a move now to do nested trials within these joint registries. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that potential, but listening to that presentation, it seems like there's something there. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Listen, I mean,
Mm.
I think we are, as we've always talked about,
Mm.
is conducting research is really, really expensive. And also, in some cases, depending on the project, can be quite inefficient because it's time, right? Time is money. And, if you're able to collect data in a way that you can have patients' data being collected and collected through registry data sets, it is dramatically reduces costs, but more importantly, also improves the efficiency which you can collect this information. So I would say that it is one of those innovations that we should be really, really stress testing and using. And hopefully we're going to start seeing more and more examples of this as we go forward. It's one thing to start presenting the idea, but it's one thing for us to really be pushing this. And I think it's a great, great advance for us in terms of cost savings as well.
Yeah, good. And the networks are already built, so it's not like you
Yeah.
have to recruit centers. So
Absolutely.
yeah, there's a real sense of optimism surrounding this. The last article in this compendium from this symposium is about using natural language processing to pull data out of large databases as well as electronic health records. And it's from the Mayo Clinic, where there's real expertise in NLP. And I've always felt that there's just the potential there of being able to have intelligent computer-based solutions to pull data out of the electronic health record had just untapped potential. And I know you in Ortho Evidence have been working on this. And what is your sense about how close we are to that reality?
Well, I would say that there's so many people working on it, which means we're getting closer and closer. It's just real energy and time and money. I mean, it always goes back to that. So it's going to be the large entities, the massive data entries, the Googles of the world, so to speak, that are going to be pushing these envelopes simply because, the value is immense. I mean, the amount of time it takes to be able to take a document and have humans scan it for what's important. Imagine if you're able to teach a system to be able to scan information and pull out the salient summary points or the salient information that can immediately be put into a system. My goodness. I mean, the opportunities are quite endless from that. And I think that is the race, right? The race to getting in that direction. And good on the group at the Mayo and others that are pushing this, field forward.
Well, I'm going to put you on the spot here. It's kind of in closing of our discussion today. Would you say we're 5 years off? Are we 10 years off? I know it's like asking you if the Leafs are going to win the Stanley Cup, but
there are many skeletons, with waving flags waiting for the Leafs to win their thing. So I'll leave it at that. But I would say it's not imminent, but it's quite probable within the next decade. I mean, in decade is I'm really giving you a very long confidence interval. The hope is that it happens in the next 5 to 10 years. It's funny, like you'd think that we'd be right at the cusp of it because we're at self-driving cars, we're at all kinds of things, we're at hyperloops. But the challenge is that it is really, really like moving into the robotic age and moving into this artificial intelligence age is, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit and everyone jumps on it, but the real complex problems are still deep in terms of getting people to move them in a direction that's meaningful. So I would hope in the next 5 years, but I think realistic within the next 10.
Well, I'll take that as a solid answer. I don't think you're waffling too much there.
No,
so, yeah. Well, I know you've got other things to do this afternoon, and I hope that your tea is of the right consistency, not too light and not too strong. And
it is currently water, but it will transform. I am going to immediately move in that direction after this.
Yeah. Well, have a good rest of your week, and I'll talk to you next week.
Excellent. Chat soon.
Bye.